I was standing by the air pump at the gas station when the patrol lights came on. Not fast. Not urgent. Just a steady flash behind a dark sedan rolling to the shoulder across the street. The driver signaled early, slowed evenly, and stopped centered along the curb. No late braking. No correction at the end. The engine shut off. The window rolled halfway down. Both hands came up and settled on the steering wheel. Palms visible. From where I stood, I could see the officer step out of his cruiser. His body camera was on. I noticed the small red light, but I didn't hear him say why the car had been stopped. No speed mentioned. No equipment issue. Nothing carried over the quiet hum of traffic. The officer's name tag read Mark Reynolds. He approached at a measured pace and stopped just short of the window. His stance was angled. One foot slightly back. One hand resting near his radio instead of a notebook. The driver kept his eyes forward until spoken to, then turned his head. I saw the exchange of documents. License. Registration. Clean movements. The driver? Later I'd learn his name was Daniel Carter. Reached slowly, keeping one hand visible at all times. When he spoke, his palms stayed open. Reynolds looked at the paperwork, then at the interior of the car, then back at Carter. He leaned in slightly. "You sure this isn't a rental?" The tone wasn't raised. It sounded routine, almost casual. Carter answered that he was visiting family. Reynolds didn't respond to the explanation. He straightened up, stepped out of the vehicle. No reason followed. Nothing was written down. The stop moved forward without a stated cause. Carter paused briefly, as if confirming the instruction, then opened the door and stepped out. He moved carefully, not rushing. Reynolds guided him toward the front of the car with 2 fingers between the shoulder blades. Light contact. Just enough to direct. Carter placed his hands on the hood when told. Spread his feet. No resistance. No argument. From a distance, it looked procedural. Ordinary. Reynolds conducted a quick pat-down. His eyes tracked the road more than the man in front of him. People usually get nervous in situations like this, he said. Carter didn't answer. His shoulders stayed level. His breathing didn't change. Reynolds stepped away and walked back to his cruiser. He sat inside and keyed his radio. From the gas station, I could hear fragments, codes, acknowledgments, but nothing specific. I checked my phone. Then the digital price sign above the pumps. Several minutes passed. No ticket book came out. I didn't see him write anything. Carter remained at the hood the entire time. He didn't shift his feet, didn't turn his head to watch passing cars. Reynolds eventually returned. "Mind making this easy for both of us?" It wasn't phrased as an order, but the expectation was clear. He asked where the car came from, asked how long Carter would be in town, asked if there was anything illegal inside the vehicle. Carter answered each question briefly. When Reynolds asked for consent to search the car, Carter said no. Polite. Direct. Reynolds exhaled, glanced down the road, then back at Carter. "You fit a description." "What description?" Carter asked. Reynolds didn't answer. He turned away and walked back to his cruiser. This time, his pace was slower. He reached for the radio again and made another call. From where I stood, I could see the glow of the screen inside the cruiser. Reynolds leaned forward, his face close to it. He didn't look away right away. Carter stayed where he was. After a moment, Reynolds stepped out again. His posture had changed. He stood square this time, not angled. His voice was lower. "Relax your arms," he said. "Just wait here." Carter lowered his hands but didn't move from the hood. "You can call your supervisor," he said. No explanation. No introduction. Just the suggestion, stated like a procedural step that should already have happened. Reynolds stopped. His thumb rested on the radio button without pressing it. Then he nodded once and turned back toward the cruiser. He made another call. This time, he stayed seated longer. When he looked at the screen again, he stared. From the outside, it still looked like a traffic stop running long. No shouting. No crowd. No clear reason given. But the sequence had shifted. Whatever authority had already been exercised was now waiting on a record that hadn't been ready when the stop moved forward. Reynolds stayed in the cruiser longer this time. From the gas station, I could see the glow of the in-car screen through the windshield. It was brighter now, angled slightly toward him. His radio wasn't crackling the way it had before. No back-and-forth chatter. He sat still, eyes forward, then down at the screen again. Daniel Carter stood where he'd been left, hands lowered but body unmoving. He hadn't leaned against the car. He hadn't turned to watch traffic. He stayed square to the hood, as the position itself mattered. Another patrol car pulled in behind Reynolds' cruiser. No lights. No siren. It was parked close, but not tight. The engine stayed running. The second officer didn't get out right away. Reynolds finally stepped out of his car and walked back toward Carter. He stopped a few feet short, leaving more space than before. He didn't circle. He didn't touch him. "I'm going to need you to wait here," he said. There was no new explanation. Nothing about the stop changed on paper. Whatever status Carter was in, it stayed that way. Carter nodded once. Reynolds turned slightly and spoke into his shoulder mic. It was a short transmission, just enough to send, not enough to clarify. He waited for the reply without saying anything else. Then he asked a question that felt different from the others. "Who did you say you were visiting again?" "My mother," Carter said. Reynolds acknowledged it with a small nod. As if logging it mentally, he glanced at the sedan, then back toward his cruiser. The second officer stepped out of his car and leaned against the open door. He didn't approach Carter. He didn't scan him up and down. His attention stayed on Reynolds, watching for cues. Reynolds walked back to his cruiser and keyed the radio again. This time, his voice dropped. I couldn't hear the words from where I stood, but the cadence was slower, more deliberate. He wasn't improvising now. He was reading or confirming something. He looked at the screen, scrolled, stopped, scrolled back. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at it. When he stepped out again, the change wasn't dramatic, just reduced. His shoulders weren't set as high. His movements were smaller, more contained. He walked to Carter and spoke without projecting. "Just need a minute," he said. Carter didn't answer. He didn't ask how long. Reynolds stepped away and motioned subtly back toward the cruiser. The second officer stayed where he was. No one moved closer to Carter. No new commands were added. The stop held its shape but stopped expanding. Time passed. I checked my phone, then the digital price sign above the pumps. The gas station routine continued around it. Doors opening, engines starting, people pulling in and leaving. No one gathered. No one filmed. From the outside, it still looked like a routine stop that was taking longer than usual. Reynolds returned to the cruiser again. This time, he didn't use the shoulder mic. He picked up the handset and held it close, turning slightly away from the road as he spoke. When he listened, his head tilted just enough to notice. He stayed seated after the call ended. Several seconds passed before he moved. When he stepped out, he didn't go straight to Carter. He walked halfway, stopped, then continued. He stood farther back now, not within arm's reach. "Mr. Carter," he said. It was the first time he'd used a name. Carter looked at him. Reynolds cleared his throat, resetting his voice. "I'm still waiting on confirmation," he said. He didn't say Carter was being detained. He didn't say he was free to leave. The status remained suspended. Carter nodded once. Reynolds looked back toward the cruiser, then at the second officer, who gave a small shrug. Reynolds reached up and adjusted his body camera, checking its position rather than turning it off. Then he keyed the radio again. This transmission was longer, more formal. He waited for the response without filling the silence. When it came, he listened all the way through. His eyes stayed forward. He didn't interrupt. When it ended, he said only, "Copy that." He stood still for a moment after. Then he walked back to Carter. "I'm going to have you hang tight a bit longer," he said. Supervisors confirming. He stepped back and watched the road instead of Carter. The second patrol car's engine shut off. The officer inside stayed seated. Reynolds' radio crackled again. The response was brief. Understood, Reynolds said. Carter was still standing by the hood of his car, in the same spot he'd been since stepping out. No citation had been issued. No search had been conducted. No charge had been stated. He hadn't been told he was free to leave, only that a supervisor was confirming. The stop was no longer escalating. But it wasn't over. Reynolds didn't speak right away after the last transmission. He stood near the front of his cruiser. Radio clipped back into place. Eyes on the road instead of the man by the hood. The second patrol car remained parked behind him. Engine off. No one moved closer. No commands were added. Daniel Carter stayed where he was. The radio crackled again. Reynolds listened all the way through this time. He didn't interrupt. When it ended, he answered with a single word. Copy. He exhaled once. Not a sigh. Just a russet. And walked back toward Carter. His pace was slower now. He stopped several feet away, leaving space between them. His body wasn't angled. He stood straight on. Sir? He said. You can relax. Carter lowered his arms fully but didn't step away from the hood. Everything's checking out. Reynolds continued. There was a delay getting confirmation. He didn't explain what had been confirmed. He didn't revisit the earlier questions. He reached up and adjusted his body camera, smoothing the strap before letting his hand fall. He glanced down briefly, as if checking that it was still recording. Before you go, Reynolds said, I'll need to document the stop. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket. It was the first time I'd seen him write anything. He noted the location, the time, the plate. His pen paused once, then moved again. What's your badge number? Carter asked. Reynolds looked up for a fraction of a second, then answered. And your supervisor's name? Carter added. Reynolds provided that as well. Carter nodded. Nothing more. Reynolds stepped back and gestured toward the sedan. You're free to go, he said. Carter walked around the front of the car, opened the door, and sat down. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He started the engine, signaled, and merged back into traffic like any other driver. The patrol cars stayed where they were. Reynolds remained standing for a moment after Carter left. He looked down at the notepad again and added one more line before closing it. He returned to his cruiser and sat without starting the engine. A few minutes passed before the second patrol car pulled away. Eventually, Reynolds merged back onto the road and disappeared in the same direction Carter had gone. From the gas station, it looked like the end of a routine stop. I didn't learn who Daniel Carter was until later. The footage from Reynolds' body camera was pulled in full. The review started at the first question and ran straight through to the moment Carter merged back into traffic. Timestamps were logged. Each command was matched to when it occurred. The first written line appeared well after the stop had already moved forward. That timing was compared against other stops. The same sequence showed up again. Extension first. Articulation later. The footage was forwarded outside the department. The review expanded. Supervisors were asked to account for why similar gaps had closed quietly in the past. Records were checked against training logs and policy language. Reynolds was placed on administrative leave. His file was reviewed line by line. The termination letter listed dates, timestamps, and deviations from procedure. No intent was cited, only sequence. His appeal was denied. The Department of Justice opened a broader inquiry into the department's stop and search practices. Oversight followed. Policies were revised. Training was updated. The chief resigned. None of it happened on the roadside. Daniel Carter returned to his work. When he later addressed the incident, he didn't describe it as unusual. He described it as familiar. He pointed out that most people who experience stops like that don't trigger immediate verification. Most people remain in the gap. What stayed with me wasn't the reveal of his title. It was the minutes. The stretch of time where authority moved ahead of documentation, where nothing illegal happened, but nothing was recorded either, where a person stood still while the system caught up. The stop itself looked ordinary. The record came later, and once it did, it didn't go away. If you've ever been held in that gap, after power was used, before it was written down, say so in the comments. For more stories that track authority step by step, subscribe to Power Abuse Stories.